I would give anything to get my hands on that limping Canadian. That's what Klaus Barbie, the Gestapo's most feared interrogator in France, reportedly snarled to his own men. He had an entire secret police apparatus at his command, hundreds of agents, informants in every cafe and train station, a torture chamber in Lyon that broke some of the toughest resistance fighters in Europe. And yet, for years, one woman slipped through his fingers again and again. The Nazis didn't know her real name. They didn't know she was American. They didn't even know she was missing part of her leg. All they knew was that she was, in their own words, the most dangerous of all Allied spies. Her name was Virginia Hall, and her story sounds almost too extraordinary to be true. A woman rejected by her own government for a physical disability. A woman denied the diplomatic career she'd spent years chasing. A woman who, by every rule of 1940s convention, should never have been allowed anywhere near a battlefield, let alone behind enemy lines. Instead, she became the architect of entire resistance networks, the coordinator of sabotage operations that blew up bridges and derailed trains, and a figure so effective that the German intelligence services dedicated enormous resources specifically to hunting her down. And for most of her life, almost no one knew any of it happened. How does a woman with a wooden leg outmaneuver the Gestapo for years in a country where she could be arrested and executed simply for being caught with the wrong piece of paper in her pocket? How does someone rejected from her own country's foreign service become one of the most valuable intelligence assets of the entire Second World War? And why, when the war finally ended and the medals were finally awarded, did Virginia Hall spend the rest of her life trying to disappear all over again, refusing interviews, refusing memoirs, refusing even to tell her closest relatives what she had actually done? To understand her, we have to go back to the beginning, to a wealthy home in Baltimore and a young woman who wanted nothing more than to see the world. Virginia Hall was born on April 6, 1906, into a comfortable, well-established family in Baltimore, Maryland. Her father had made his fortune in banking and movie theaters, and Virginia grew up with every advantage that money could buy: private schooling, travel, and education in languages that would later prove indispensable. But comfort never seemed to satisfy her restless mind. From childhood, classmates remembered her as fiercely independent, athletic, unwilling to accept the limits placed on young women of her era. She once, reportedly, wore a bracelet fashioned from a live snake to school, less out of rebellion than simple curiosity about how far she could push against expectation. That curiosity would define the rest of her life. Virginia studied at Radcliffe and Barnard, immersing herself in French, German, and Italian, before continuing her education at George Washington University, and later traveling to Europe to study further. Her ambition was singular and specific. She wanted to become a career diplomat for the United States Foreign Service, one of the very few women pursuing such a path at a time when the profession remained almost entirely closed to them. She took a clerical position at the American consulate in Warsaw, then transferred to Izmir, Turkey, working diligently in roles far beneath her ambitions, hoping each assignment might finally open the door to the career she truly wanted. Then, in 1933, everything changed in an instant. While hunting birds near Izmir, Virginia's shotgun discharged accidentally, tearing into her own left foot. Infection set in rapidly, and as gangrene spread through the tissue, doctors made the only decision that could save her life: amputation below the knee. She woke from surgery a 27-year-old woman with one leg, fitted soon after with a heavy, awkward wooden prosthesis that she would come to name, with characteristic dry humor, Cuthbert. It was a small, private joke that revealed something essential about her character: a refusal to let tragedy define her without at least getting the last word. The injury should have been survivable in every practical sense, and it was. Virginia walked, traveled, worked, lived an active life despite the discomfort and the awkward gait it left her with. But one door slammed shut permanently. The State Department's regulations at the time explicitly barred anyone with a significant physical disability from serving as a career diplomat. Virginia applied anyway, again and again, using every connection and every argument she could muster. Each time, the answer came back the same. Her dream, the singular ambition that had driven her entire adult life until that point, was over. For most people, this would have been the end of the story. For Virginia Hall, it was only the beginning. She continued working in minor consular positions across Europe throughout the 1930s, watching from a diplomat's peripheral vantage point as fascism metastasized across the continent. She witnessed the rise of Hitler in Germany, the annexation of Austria, the slow, grinding collapse of the old European order. By 1939, with war finally erupting, Virginia was living in Paris, and rather than fleeing to the safety of American neutrality, she volunteered as an ambulance driver for the French army. It was dangerous, exhausting, unglamorous work, hauling wounded soldiers through chaos and confusion. And then, in June 1940, France collapsed entirely, its army shattered, its government surrendering to Nazi Germany in a matter of weeks. Virginia Hall found herself trapped in a country now controlled by the very forces she despised most. Rather than returning home to the safety of the still neutral United States, Virginia made her way instead to London, a city bracing itself for what everyone assumed would be an imminent German invasion. It was there, at the Spanish border town of Irun during her journey, that she crossed paths with a British agent named George Bellows. Something about her struck him immediately. Her intelligence, her composure under pressure, her fluency in multiple languages, and above all, her burning desire to fight back against the Nazi occupation of the country she had come to love. Bellows handed her a phone number in London and told her simply that a friend of his might have use for someone like her. Bored and restless in London, working a minor clerical job at the American Embassy, Virginia eventually dialed that number. The voice on the other end belonged to Nicholas Boardington, an officer with Britain's newly formed Special Operations Executive, a clandestine organization that answered directly to Winston Churchill himself. Churchill had ordered the SOE into existence with a single, blunt instruction: set Europe ablaze. Its mission was sabotage, subversion, and the organization of resistance networks across every country the Nazis now occupied. The SOE was desperate for capable agents willing to operate behind enemy lines, and finding them was proving far harder than anyone in London had anticipated. Most conventional recruits, military officers, trained intelligence professionals, were far too recognizable, too easily traced back to the British war machine. What the SOE needed instead were unremarkable people who could disappear into occupied territory without drawing suspicion, who spoke the local language fluently, who understood the culture from the inside rather than as an outsider peering in. Virginia Hall, an American civilian fluent in French, familiar with the country's customs, and utterly determined to fight, was exactly the kind of asset SOE had been struggling to find. There was only one obvious problem. The organization had never before sent a woman into the field as a resident agent inside occupied France. The SOE's leadership debated the question extensively. Sending women into direct combat roles ran against deeply ingrained military convention, and many senior officers doubted whether a woman could survive the brutal realities of underground work in Nazi territory. But necessity has a way of overriding tradition, and by 1941, the organization had grown desperate enough to take the risk. Virginia was accepted, underwent rapid and intensive training in tradecraft, communications, and survival, and was assigned a cover identity as a reporter for the New York Post, a plausible role that would allow her to travel, ask questions, and gather information without immediately arousing suspicion. In August 1941, she crossed into Vichy, France, becoming the first female SOE resident agent ever deployed into the field. She settled in Lyon, a sprawling industrial city in the unoccupied southern zone that had quickly become one of the beating hearts of the French resistance. Working with almost no support network, no established contacts, and constant risk of discovery, Virginia began methodically building an intelligence and sabotage operation from absolutely nothing. She recruited doctors willing to treat wounded agents in secret. She found safe houses where downed Allied pilots could hide until they could be smuggled to safety. She established communication channels back to London, coded messages hidden inside seemingly innocent radio broadcasts. Within months, her network, codenamed Heckler, had grown into one of the most productive resistance operations anywhere in occupied France. The work was relentless and unforgiving. Every meeting carried the risk of betrayal. Every safe house could be the one under surveillance. Every courier could secretly be working for the enemy. Virginia moved constantly, changing her lodgings and routines to avoid establishing predictable patterns, cultivating relationships with sympathetic French police officers who could warn her of impending raids, and maintaining an outward appearance of calm professionalism, even as the danger around her intensified by the week. She wasn't simply gathering intelligence anymore. She was becoming the connective tissue holding an entire underground resistance apparatus together, the person other agents turned to when they needed money, weapons, false papers, or simply somewhere safe to disappear. In October 1941, Virginia orchestrated one of her most audacious operations yet, the jailbreak of several captured SOE agents held in a French prison. Working with local contacts, she arranged safe houses, transportation, and even French police uniforms to help disguise the escaping men. The operation succeeded brilliantly, and several of the freed agents went on to lead further resistance circuits of their own, multiplying the damage done to the German occupation many times over. But success came with a devastating price. The Nazis were furious, humiliated by the audacity of the escape, and they responded by flooding the unoccupied southern zone with hundreds of additional security agents, their singular focus fixed on the city of Lyon. Among those newly arriving security officials was a young SS officer named Klaus Barbie, soon to earn the nickname the Butcher of Lyon for his brutal interrogation methods and his direct role in the deportation of thousands of Jews and resistance fighters to concentration camps. Barbie's network of informants grew wider and more sophisticated by the month, and the protective relationships Virginia had cultivated with local police began crumbling under the sheer scale of the German security presence. What had once been a manageable risk was rapidly becoming an existential threat, not just to Virginia herself, but to every agent and resistance fighter connected to her network across the region. By the autumn of 1942, cracks were forming everywhere. A French resistance network operating around Paris, codenamed Gloria, had been infiltrated by German intelligence, and the ripples of that betrayal threatened to spread outward, potentially exposing agents Virginia had personally recruited and protected for over a year. She sent an urgent message back to London. Her time in France, she warned, was running out. But extraction wasn't simple. There was no convenient plane waiting to whisk her to safety, no easy escape route across a heavily guarded, increasingly militarized border. If Virginia Hall was going to survive what was coming, she would have to find her own way out, through some of the most dangerous mountain terrain in Western Europe. For nearly 2 more months after her warning to London, Virginia remained in France, methodically changing safe houses and identities almost weekly, still working to protect the network she had spent over a year building. Then, in November 1942, the situation turned catastrophic. Allied forces launched Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa, and in response, Nazi Germany abandoned any pretense of respecting the unoccupied southern zone of France, flooding it with troops and occupying the entire country outright. The borders were about to be sealed completely. Virginia had hours, not days, to escape a country she had transformed into a battlefield of quiet sabotage, and the only viable route to safety lay across the towering, snow-covered peaks of the Pyrenees Mountains. Accompanied by a small group of fellow escapees, Virginia set out on a grueling, multi-day trek across mountain passes rising well over 7,000 feet, through snow, ice, and brutal winter cold, all while carrying the physical burden of her wooden prosthetic leg. Every step risked the artificial limb slipping, catching, or simply failing under the strain of uneven, frozen terrain. At one point along the punishing journey, Virginia radioed London with characteristic understatement, reporting that she was safe, but that Cuthbert was giving her trouble. Unaware that Cuthbert was her own leg, London's baffled reply crackled back across the wire. If Cuthbert was causing her difficulty, they suggested, she should have him eliminated. Despite the exhaustion, the cold, and the constant risk of discovery by border patrols, Virginia completed the brutal crossing and reached Spanish territory. Freedom, however, proved short-lived. Spanish authorities promptly arrested her for crossing the border illegally, an almost absurd twist of fate for a woman who had just outrun the entire German security apparatus in France. She spent roughly 6 weeks in a Spanish jail before American diplomatic officials, alerted to her situation, negotiated her release. It was a strange, almost anticlimactic conclusion to one of the most dramatic escapes of the entire war. But Virginia Hall was, against every reasonable expectation, still alive, and she had absolutely no intention of stopping. Following her release, Virginia worked for a period with SOE operations in Madrid before finally returning to London in the summer of 1943. She had proven herself, beyond any reasonable doubt, as one of the organization's most capable and resilient field agents. And yet, when she requested reassignment back into France to continue her work, SOE leadership refused. She was simply too well known now, too compromised by the German intelligence services, who had spent over a year hunting her specifically. Sending her back, they argued, would be sending her directly into a trap. For a woman who had risked her life for 2 years building resistance networks from nothing, being sidelined for her own protection felt less like mercy and more like a quiet, frustrating dismissal. Refusing to accept a desk job while the war raged on, Virginia enrolled in a wireless telegraphy course, mastering the notoriously difficult skill of transmitting and receiving coded radio messages under pressure, a role so dangerous that the average life expectancy for wireless operators in occupied France was measured in mere weeks. Armed with this new qualification, she approached America's own fledgling intelligence service, the Office of Strategic Services, freshly established and eager for experienced field operatives. The OSS, despite her extensive record of proven success, offered her a position at the surprisingly low rank of second lieutenant, a rank that dramatically understated everything she had already accomplished on the ground in France. Virginia accepted anyway. Rank meant little to her compared to the opportunity to return to the fight. In March 1944, just months before the planned Allied invasion of Normandy, she boarded a British motor gunboat bound for the coast of Brittany, landing under cover of darkness at a remote beach near Roscoff. This time, her disguise was radically transformed. Gone was any hint of the sophisticated American reporter she had once played. Instead, Virginia appeared as an elderly French peasant woman, her hair dyed gray, her teeth deliberately filed down to mimic decades of poor rural dental care, her natural limp disguised within the exaggerated shuffle of an old woman's gait. She was assigned, at least nominally, as a wireless operator supporting an older, more experienced OSS officer who was meant to lead the new network, codenamed Saint. It was considered, at the time, simply too radical a proposition that a woman might lead an intelligence network of her own. But Virginia quickly grew frustrated with her supposed superior, whom she privately judged to be dangerously talkative and careless with operational security. Within weeks, she had effectively separated herself from him entirely, instructing her own growing web of contacts never to reveal her whereabouts to him. She was, in every practical sense that mattered, running her own operation once again. Adopting the cover identity of a rural Frenchwoman named Marcelle Montaigne, Virginia made her way to the mountainous Haute-Loire region in central France, an area rich with Maquis resistance fighters, armed bands of guerrillas hiding in remote forests and villages, waiting for weapons, training, and direction. Aware that her accent might betray her foreign origins under close scrutiny, she enlisted a local Frenchwoman to accompany her and speak on her behalf whenever necessary. Slowly and carefully, exactly as she had done in Lyon years earlier, Virginia began building an entire operational network from almost nothing. One contact, one safe house, one carefully vetted resistance cell at a time. Her mission this time carried even higher stakes than before. With the Allied invasion of Normandy rapidly approaching, Virginia's task was to arm, train, and coordinate French resistance fighters so they could rise up in support of the invasion, disrupting German reinforcements, cutting communication lines, and tying down enemy forces that might otherwise be redirected to the Normandy beaches. Working almost entirely without direct support from other Allied agents, she organized parachute drops of weapons and supplies, established radio contact with London for coordination, and personally trained resistance fighters in demolition techniques, sabotage tactics, and basic guerrilla warfare, transforming disorganized bands of villagers and farmers into a genuinely effective fighting force. The results of her work were staggering by any measure. Under her direction and coordination, resistance fighters cut 16 railway lines, derailed 8 German trains, destroyed 4 critical railway bridges, and severed telephone communications across the region, all while suffering remarkably few casualties themselves compared to the damage inflicted on the occupying forces. One OSS report later credited operations connected to her network with derailing multiple freight trains and either killing or capturing hundreds of German soldiers. For an intelligence officer working largely alone, without a conventional chain of command backing her up in the field, the scale of destruction and disruption she orchestrated was almost unprecedented, and German commanders were growing increasingly desperate to identify whoever was responsible. When D-Day finally arrived on June 6, 1944, the sabotage campaigns Virginia had spent months preparing shifted into overdrive. Bridges collapsed, rail lines went silent. German units attempting to reinforce the Normandy front found themselves delayed, rerouted, and harassed at nearly every turn by resistance fighters she had personally trained and equipped. The Germans, growing increasingly aware that an unusually skilled and elusive operative was orchestrating chaos throughout the Haute-Loire, redoubled their efforts to identify and capture her. They gave her a new nickname of their own this time, Artemis, the ancient huntress, an unintentionally fitting title for a woman who had spent years hunting opportunities to undermine their entire occupation from within. As the summer of 1944 progressed and Allied forces pushed further inland from Normandy, Virginia's resistance fighters, now organized into 3 full battalions numbering roughly 1,500 men, undertook increasingly ambitious operations against the retreating German forces. They forced enemy troops to abandon the strategically important town of Le Puy-en-Velay entirely, pushing them northward alongside the broader German withdrawal sweeping across France. In a moment of characteristically dry humor, Virginia later noted that an official Allied support team, finally parachuted in to help train and supply her forces, arrived only after the Germans had already been cleared from the entire department, rendering their assistance almost comically unnecessary. By late August 1944, the liberation of France was rapidly accelerating. Paris itself was freed on August 25th, its streets filling with jubilant crowds as American troops rolled through in a triumphant procession the following day. Virginia and several of the British and American officers who had worked alongside her throughout the Haute-Loire campaign made their way to the newly liberated capital, arriving there by late September. The desperate, dangerous phase of her mission was drawing to a close. But rather than simply resting on the extraordinary success she had achieved, Virginia pressed onward, traveling next into Austria alongside fellow OSS operative Paul Goyo to help foment anti-Nazi resistance in one of the last remaining corners of Hitler's collapsing empire. Paul Goyo had originally served as one of the officers working under Virginia's command during the Haute-Loire operations, and over the intense, dangerous months they spent working together, a genuine relationship had developed between them. When Nazi Germany finally collapsed in the spring of 1945, Virginia and Guillot returned together to Paris, where she began the meticulous work of documenting her operations, identifying and recommending French civilians who deserved formal recognition for the risks they had taken to assist Allied efforts, and formally resigning from the OSS. The urgent, dangerous work she had dedicated years of her life to was finally, officially complete. In September 1945, in a quiet, private ceremony held specifically to protect her identity even after the war's conclusion, Major General William Wild Bill Donovan, the legendary head of the OSS, presented Virginia Hall with the Distinguished Service Cross, the United States Army's second highest decoration for valor. She remains, to this day, the only civilian woman ever awarded that particular honor during the entire Second World War. The citation accompanying her medal noted with careful understatement that since 1942, Virginia had devoted herself entirely to intelligence work, without regard to the dangerous position in which her activities would place her if discovered by the enemy she had spent years quietly, methodically undermining. Beyond the Distinguished Service Cross, Virginia's wartime service was eventually recognized with additional honors from two other nations she had risked her life to defend. Britain, whose Special Operations Executive had given her the very first opportunity to serve as a field agent, quietly appointed her an honorary member of the Order of the British Empire. France, the country whose resistance networks she had built, trained, and led through some of its darkest years of occupation, awarded her the Croix de Guerre, one of its highest military honors. Few individuals in the entire war, and virtually no women, walked away with recognition from three separate Allied nations for service rendered directly on the ground, behind enemy lines. Given the sheer scale of her achievements, one might expect Virginia Hall to have emerged from the war as a celebrated public hero, the subject of newsreels, memoirs, and triumphant homecoming parades. Instead, almost the opposite occurred. The very qualities that had made her such an effective spy, her discretion, her refusal to seek attention, her instinct for operating quietly beneath the surface of ordinary life, meant that her extraordinary story remained almost entirely hidden from public view for decades. She granted no interviews, she wrote no memoir. Even close relatives reportedly knew only fragments of what she had actually done during those years in occupied France, and Virginia showed no interest whatsoever in correcting that gap. Rather than settling into a quiet retirement befitting a war hero, Virginia continued working in intelligence, joining the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency when it was established in 1947, becoming one of the organization's earliest female employees, and, in many respects, a genuine founding figure of American Cold War espionage. Her expertise, forged through years of real operational experience behind enemy lines, should theoretically have made her an invaluable asset within the agency's ranks. The reality of her post-war career, however, proved considerably more frustrating and considerably less celebrated than her wartime exploits might have suggested to any outside observer. Within the CIA's rigid, male-dominated bureaucratic culture of the 1950s and 1960s, Virginia's extraordinary field experience counted for surprisingly little. She was largely relegated to analytical desk positions, far removed from the kind of active fieldwork that had defined her wartime career, and that she had proven, beyond any reasonable doubt, she excelled at more capably than almost anyone else in the organization. Colleagues later admitted that the agency's leadership simply didn't know what to do with a woman whose skill set didn't fit neatly into the era's rigid expectations about gender and career advancement. One of the most effective spies of the entire Second World War spent much of her Cold War career quietly underutilized. Virginia married Paul Guillot, her wartime OSS colleague and companion from the Haute Loire operations, and the two settled into a comparatively ordinary domestic life outside Washington, D.C., raising chickens and cultivating a farm in rural Maryland. It was, in many ways, a deliberately unremarkable existence for a woman who had once outmaneuvered the Gestapo across the French countryside. Friends and neighbors who encountered her during these years had little idea of the extraordinary history hidden behind her quiet, reserved demeanor. She remained, by every account, exactly the kind of person she had trained herself to become decades earlier, someone who could disappear into ordinary life without drawing a second glance. Virginia continued working for the CIA until 1966, when mandatory retirement regulations finally forced her, at the age of 60, to leave the agency she had helped establish nearly 2 decades earlier. Even in retirement, she remained characteristically tight-lipped about her wartime service, declining opportunities to discuss her experiences publicly and showing little interest in the kind of recognition that many of her male counterparts actively pursued after the war. Decades later, a former OSS colleague reportedly showed her a memo from General Donovan himself, dated years earlier, explicitly granting her permission to finally speak openly about her work. According to those who knew her, Virginia still declined to say much of anything at all. Virginia Hall Goyot died on July 8, 1982, at the age of 76, largely unknown to the broader American public, despite having been, by any objective measure, one of the most effective and courageous intelligence operatives the United States ever produced. For years afterward, her story remained scattered across classified files, brief mentions in specialized histories of the SOE and OSS, and the fading memories of the dwindling handful of colleagues who had actually worked alongside her. The woman the Gestapo had once considered their most dangerous adversary in all of occupied France had, by the time of her death, become almost entirely invisible to the country she had served so extraordinarily well. It would take decades for Virginia Hall's story to receive anything approaching the recognition it deserved. Historians and researchers, digging through declassified SOE and OSS files released gradually in the decades following the war, slowly began piecing together the full, staggering scope of her achievements. Biographers uncovered operational reports, wartime correspondence, and first-hand testimonies from resistance fighters and fellow agents who had worked alongside her, gradually revealing a portrait far more remarkable than even the sparse public record had previously suggested. What emerged wasn't simply the story of a competent wartime clerk who had gotten lucky. It was the story of one of the most consequential intelligence officers of the entire 20th century. In 2016, the Central Intelligence Agency itself formally acknowledged Virginia Hall's extraordinary legacy, unveiling a portrait of her within its Langley headquarters and publishing detailed accounts of her wartime service that had previously remained buried within classified archives. The CIA's own historians noted with clear admiration that Hall's combination of courage, resourcefulness, and absolute operational discipline made her one of the finest field officers the agency and its wartime predecessor had ever employed. It was a striking, overdue tribute to a woman who had spent decades of her own post-war career being quietly overlooked by the very institution she had helped bring into existence. Virginia Hall's story has since inspired numerous books, documentaries, and dramatic retellings, introducing her remarkable history to entirely new generations who had never previously encountered her name. Sonia Purnell's acclaimed 2019 biography, A Woman of No Importance, brought Virginia's wartime exploits to a mainstream audience for the first time, drawing extensively on declassified documents and painstaking historical research to reconstruct the full scope of her operations in France. The book's title itself carried a pointed irony, borrowed from a German intelligence memo that had once dismissively referred to the mysterious, elusive agent operating in Lyon as a woman of little significance, a catastrophic underestimation that would come to define the entire Nazi effort to capture her. What makes Virginia Hall's story so enduringly remarkable isn't simply the scale of her wartime achievements, staggering as they were. It's the specific combination of factors that should have, by every conventional expectation of her era, prevented her from accomplishing any of it at all. She was a woman working within intelligence organizations that had never before trusted women with independent field command. She operated with a physical disability that her own government had once used as grounds to reject her diplomatic ambitions entirely. And she achieved all of this while deliberately avoiding the recognition, the medal ceremonies, and the public acclaim that might have made her achievements more widely known during her own lifetime. Perhaps most striking of all is the sheer psychological discipline her success required. For years, Virginia lived under the constant, grinding awareness that a single mistake, one careless conversation, one poorly disguised limp, one informant with a sharp enough eye could result in capture, torture, and death. The Gestapo's network in Lyon alone had broken and executed countless resistance operatives during the very years Virginia was operating there. That she managed not simply to survive, but to consistently outperform trained male intelligence officers throughout multiple deployments speaks to a rare combination of intelligence, composure, and sheer force of will that transcends almost any conventional measure of wartime heroism. Historians studying the broader history of the Special Operations Executive and Office of Strategic Services often point to Virginia Hall as a pivotal figure in demonstrating definitively that women could serve as effective, independent field operatives in the most dangerous intelligence work imaginable. Her success helped pave the way for greater opportunities for the hundreds of other women who served in SOE and OSS operations throughout the war, many of whom paid the ultimate price for their service. Roughly 40% of female SOE agents deployed into France did not survive the war, captured, executed, or sent to die in Nazi concentration camps. Virginia's survival against those brutal odds remains as remarkable as her operational achievements themselves. There's a particular irony worth sitting with in Virginia Hall's story, one that feels strikingly relevant even today. The very disability that closed off her original ambition, a career in traditional diplomacy, ultimately propelled her toward a far more consequential path, one that reshaped the course of resistance operations across occupied France and directly supported the success of the Allied invasion of Normandy. Had the State Department accepted her decades earlier, Virginia Hall might have lived out an entirely conventional diplomatic career, competent, respectable, and almost certainly forgotten by history. Instead, rejection redirected her toward a mission that made her, quite literally, one of the most feared Allied operatives the Nazi regime ever encountered. Klaus Barbie, the Gestapo officer who once vowed to capture the limping Canadian spy tormenting his operations in Lyon, never did get his hands on Virginia Hall. He was eventually captured after the war, tried for crimes against humanity decades later, and died in a French prison in 1991, having never learned the true identity of the elusive operative who had haunted his wartime career. The woman he considered one of his most dangerous adversaries lived out her remaining years in quiet obscurity on a Maryland farm, raising chickens, declining interviews, and carrying the full weight of her extraordinary history in near total silence until her death. Today, Virginia Hall's legacy occupies a curious, evolving space in American historical memory, simultaneously celebrated within intelligence circles as one of the finest field officers the country ever produced, and still largely unknown to the broader public that benefited from her wartime service. A dedicated CIA training facility now bears her name. Museums and archives continue researching and preserving records of her operations. And each new generation of biographers and documentary filmmakers who encounter her story tends to arrive at the same striking conclusion, that Virginia Hall accomplished more, against greater odds, with less recognition than almost any other Allied operative of the entire Second World War. Her story raises an uncomfortable, enduring question that extends well beyond the specific details of Nazi-occupied France. How many other Virginia Halls has history simply failed to notice? Individuals whose extraordinary contributions were quietly overlooked because they didn't fit the conventional expectations of their era, their gender, or their physical capabilities. Virginia herself seemed entirely unbothered by the question of recognition during her own lifetime, content in the knowledge that her work had genuinely mattered. that the resistance fighters she trained had genuinely disrupted Nazi operations, that the intelligence she gathered had genuinely saved lives. Whether history remembered her properly seemed to Virginia Hall almost beside the point entirely.
Perhaps that's the most enduring lesson embedded within Virginia Hall's extraordinary life. Real courage, the kind that reshapes the outcome of history, rarely announces itself with fanfare or medals or public acclaim. It often operates quietly, in the shadows, disguised as an elderly milkmaid shuffling along a French country road, invisible to everyone except the enemies desperate enough to hunt it down, and never quite capable of catching it. Virginia Hall spent a lifetime proving that the most dangerous person in any room is rarely the one making noise. It's the one everyone else has simply, catastrophically underestimated. If you are a hunter, subscribe and join the hunt. Before you go, thank you for staying until the very end. In a world of endless scrolling and short attention spans, you chose to spend this time exploring real human stories. That means more than you know. If these stories moved you, made you think, or helped you see the world a little differently, please subscribe and turn on notifications. It's the best way to support this channel and make sure more stories like these continue to be told. And if one of these stories stayed with you after the video ended, share it with someone you care about. One message, one repost can help these voices reach someone who needs to hear them. Leave a comment and tell me which story touched you the most. I read every one. Thank you for your time, your curiosity, and your heart. I'll see you in the next story. If you are a hunter, subscribe and join the hunt.